Hello, I'm Jonathan Dean. I'm a lecturer in physical geography, and in this short talk, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the topics relating to climate change that we talk about in our degree at the University of Hull. So, firstly, we're going to think about how climate changed in the past, and then we'll think about how climate's changing now and how it will change into the future. So, firstly, focusing on the past. So, the dinosaurs died out around 66 million years ago. So this graph here, you can see along the bottom, goes from 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs died out to the present day. And this graph basically shows you, just think of this as relative temperature change. So when the dinosaurs were around, it's about 9 degrees warmer than now. So just think of 0 as present day temperatures. 50 million years ago, it was about 12 degrees warmer than now. And then you can see from there was then this gradual cooling trend, and it got colder and colder and colder. So eventually, about 34 million years ago, it was cold enough for ice to form on Antarctica. And then by about 2.5 million years ago, it was cold enough for ice to form on Greenland. So what caused this global cooling trend that we've seen? Well, as we know now, we are at the moment putting CO2 into the atmosphere. That's causing global warming. So the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that can also, in the past, vary naturally. So what was happening over the last tens of millions of years is that there was less CO2 being put into the atmosphere through fewer volcanic eruptions, for instance, but also there were various other processes going on, like some weathering processes that allowed loads of carbon to be withdrawn from the atmosphere. So not only is less CO2 being put into the atmosphere, more is being taken out of the atmosphere as well. So gradually there was less and less and less CO2 in the atmosphere, so the greenhouse effect was declining, so it got cooler and cooler and cooler. So eventually we ended up with a point where there was ice in both Antarctica and in the northern hemisphere, so particularly Greenland. So we can see that from that graph there. There are variations within that. There's shorter term variations, but the long term trend over tens of millions of years has been to these cooler conditions. So we can reconstruct how climate changed in the past, and there has been this long term cooling trend due to decreasing amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. So now we're going to think about how changes in climate in the past may have caused changes in human history. So going back millions of years, there was probably a split around 7 million years ago from the species that went on to become the apes, the great apes that we know today, and the species, gradually there were various different species, and they ended up with us, Homo sapiens. Okay, so it was about 7 million years ago that there was this split. But there was a series of different species before we ended up with us. So these species gradually got more and more human-like. So what caused evolution? What caused the evolution of these different species? And in particular, what caused the switch from the first of these species after the split from the ones that went on to become apes? The first of these species would have walked on 4 legs, but gradually, over time, there was the evolution of species that got more and more human-like and started walking on 2 legs. So what caused that? Well, we can see on this graph here, so you can see here we've got a vertical axis going from 5 million years ago to the present day. So we can see here that we have this long-term cooling trend. That's what we saw in the previous graph. And in East Africa, which is where the evolution is occurring, what that means for East Africa, this global cooling trend, is that East Africa gets drier and drier and drier. So we get a switch from a time when it was wetter and you had basically tropical rainforest to the present day vegetation in Eastern Africa, which is more savanna grasslands. If you watch a nature documentary and see lions running around, it's reasonably dry. There's not loads of trees, are there? So that global cooling trend led to that drying trend in Eastern Africa, and that could have caused the evolution of species that walked on 2 legs. So when it was wetter and you had these rainforests, it would have been advantageous to walk on 4 legs because you needed to climb trees as well as move small distances along the ground in the forest. Whereas when it switched to savanna grassland, it was more advantageous to walk on 2 legs because you needed to walk greater distances, so it's more efficient to have 2 legs rather than 4 walking these larger distances. Don't need to climb trees anymore, and also being on 2 legs you can be taller, so you can see over the top of grass to see where your prey is, the things you want to hunt. So yeah, this climate change may have caused the evolution of these human-like species that walked on 2 legs. Climate change may also have led to increased brain size as we go through these various different species and end up with Homo sapiens. So, yeah, this is, as I said, these species become more and more human-like. So one part of that is walking on 2 legs. Another part of that is having larger brains. So what seems to happen? So over the last 7 million years, we have that long-term cooling trend. But what we also have is, on top of that, what we see is that the climate becomes more and more and more unstable. There's more and more and more climate variation. We have these rapid shifts between wetter and drier in Eastern Africa. So as the climate becomes more unstable, and every time we see a time when it's really, really unstable, what seems to happen is at the same time we get the evolution of a new species which has a bigger brain. Now, having a bigger brain means they're more intelligent and better able to cope with, or better able to think of, right, how can we find this water resource? How can we hunt something differently? Because it's now got drier and it's more difficult to hunt what we used to hunt, so we need to hunt something else. How do we think of a way to hunt that? Having a bigger brain allows them to better able to cope with this environmental instability and work out new ways of getting water and food. Okay, so now our species Homo sapien evolved probably about 400, 300,000 years ago in Eastern Africa. So initially it just spread around Africa, but then around 100,000 years ago, we think Homo sapiens left Africa for the first time. So there's evidence in caves in Israel and Saudi Arabia that Homo sapiens had got out by this point. However, it looks like these people either died out or they just went back into Africa to join the people who hadn't left Africa. Because it looks like, based on genetic evidence, it looks like it was people that left Africa around 60,000 years ago. It looks like they are the people that went on to populate the rest of the world. So if you look at the DNA of modern humans, it looks like modern day non-African humans are descended from these people that left around 60,000 years ago. So reaching Europe and Australia probably by 40,000 years ago. At the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were a lot lower and you could walk from Siberia into Alaska, that's exactly what people did. So they got to the Americas by 20,000 years ago. Maybe got down to the bottom of South America, maybe close to 10,000 years ago potentially. But anyway, that's how Homo sapiens populated the world. So why did they leave? Why did some Homo sapiens leave Africa 60,000 years ago? Could that have been due to climate change as well? Well, what we see in East Africa 60,000 years ago is that this is in the midst of a shift from generally wetter climate to generally drier climate. So it could have been that there was this climate change in East Africa going on, and maybe that pushed some people out. Maybe the carrying capacity of East Africa wasn't great enough for the people that were living there, so some people got pushed out and they left East Africa. Now at this time, even though East Africa was potentially getting dry and that may have pushed some people out, North Africa, where the Sahara now is, was wetter. So it wasn't a desert, it was more savanna grassland at certain times in the past. So this would have meant that they were able to cross through North Africa, because now it'd be quite hard to cross through North Africa, wouldn't it, because the Sahara's there. Whereas at this time, it was savanna grassland, so it would have been easier for people to migrate north and then eventually go out of Africa. So everyone's hunter-gatherers. They're all spreading around the world, but they're all still hunter-gatherers. It's only around 11,000 years ago that agriculture starts. So it starts in the Middle East around 11,000 years ago. In other parts of the world, it starts a bit later. So agriculture is key for human civilization because agriculture produces more food so it can support greater population densities than hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gathering basically requires the entire population to be hunting or gathering. Farming doesn't, obviously. So you're not farmers. You're all watching this video. I imagine you're not farmers. I'm sure a lot of your parents aren't farmers. So it shows that it frees up people to do other things. So once farming was invented and people were freed up to do other things, they could do things like think, and they could invent things like the wheel and the written language. These things were only invented after farming had been invented, which allowed people to be freed up to think and invent these things. So again, why did climate develop when it did? So it developed around 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. Let's have a look at the climate from that time. Well, the climate in the Middle East at that time was nice and warm and wet and stable. So before that was the glacial period. It was too dry, would have been too difficult to farm. Suddenly switched to this warm, wet, stable conditions, which are even nicer conditions than they are in the present day. And this really helped agriculture to develop because it was just easier if it's warm and wet, and particularly if it's stable. So what we mean by stable is that the climate's not constantly switching from year to year, from decade to decade, from wetter to drier. It's stable for quite a few centuries, maybe a few millennium, which means that the farmers could experiment without having to adapt to a changing climate. They could experiment and just work out literally how to farm without having to also cope with climate changes as well. So the climate at that time could have helped agriculture develop. So yeah, shift to drier conditions may have forced the evolution of these human-like species to walk on two legs. Increased variability of climate may have forced the evolution of these human-like species to have bigger and bigger brains. A change in climate in Eastern Africa may explain why some Homo sapiens left Africa around 60,000 years ago, and then agriculture developed in the Middle East around 11,000 years ago, partly because the climate was nice and warm and wet and stable. Okay, so now on to think about present and future climate. So this is how climate has changed since the Industrial Revolution, or midway through the Industrial Revolution. So this is global averaged temperature. So we've had about 1 degree of warming since the Industrial Revolution, probably a bit over that now. What's caused this? Well, dramatic increases in greenhouse gases due to us burning fossil fuels. So now we're well over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, actually. So what does this mean, this climate, this global warming? So when we think about global warming, it's not we're thinking about the temperature rise, but it's not the temperature rise itself that we're worried about particularly. It's the changes in precipitation patterns, the changes in sea level that global warming causes that we're more worried about. Okay, so if it gets a few degrees warmer, in most parts of the world, that direct change of a few degrees warmer is not particularly going to be a problem compared to the changes that we would see in precipitation and the sea level rise that we'd see. So change in precipitation, some parts of the world will get wetter and they might get too wet, so they have loads of floods. Some parts of the world might get dry and get too dry, so some parts of the world might be able to farm at the moment, whereas in a few decades it might be too dry to farm, too dry. And then in terms of sea level rise, global warming, melting ice sheets, putting more water into the oceans, causing rises in sea level. So we're likely to get, by the end of this century, between 1 and 2 metres of sea level rise. So this is what it looks like in around Hull. This is what would go below sea level if you had about 1 metre of sea level rise. So this doesn't mean all these areas go underwater, because you could build some barriers to keep the water out, like they do in the Netherlands, but it shows what areas are threatened by even a reasonably small amount of sea level rise. So global warming is already causing we're already seeing it in terms of big effects on human society. So the Syrian Civil War, there was a 15-year drought that affected Syria between 1998 and 2012. So this led to the movement of large numbers of people from the countryside who were farmers, could no longer farm. They moved to the cities to find work. Protests started. The way the government dealt with the protests obviously inflamed the situation. There were other things as well. There were terrorists coming in from Iraq. But a lot of the reason for the protests initially starting was because of this drought, which led to lots of people moving to the cities. So the way the Syrian government managed the water that remained wasn't great, but a lot of this problem is caused by global warming. It's caused by everyone around the world releasing these greenhouse gases and causing global warming. So it shows that global warming is already causing key changes in human society. So yeah, UK emissions have been declining since the 80s as we've moved, as there's been deindustrialisation, and then more recently successive governments have brought in a series of quite stringent policies. So for instance, there will be no coal-fired power stations operating in Britain within a few years, and we are really moving to particularly wind power as a key generator of electricity, and then petrol and diesel cars won't be sold from 2030. But in a lot of the world, a lot of countries are still increasing their emissions. So as a global total, emissions generally over the last few years have been going up and up and up. It might be lower in 2020 due to COVID, but the general trend has been up, whereas a few countries have been managing to reduce their emissions year upon year. So yeah, human greenhouse gas emissions have caused about 1 degree of warming since the Industrial Revolution. UK is reducing its emissions. Quite a few other countries are as well, but most countries aren't. So the global trend is still upwards, and we need to turn that around really quickly if we are going to limit how much warming there is. And the more we limit the global warming, the less sea level rise there will be, and the less change in precipitation patterns there will be, and the better able we will be to cope with this global warming. So yeah, to sum up all of that then, so the climate has changed naturally in the past. This influenced the course of human history. Humans, we are now causing climate change, and that will change the course of human history too.